Day 5 of the 2024 St. Louis Rapid Blitz saw the final day of action, with the field playing another 9-round blitz round robin. After all was said and done, it was Alireza Firouzja who ended up winning the tournament after scoring 5.5 out of 9 on the day and clinching the event with 2 rounds to spare. Going into the day, Firouzja had a 2-point advantage over his closest rivals, Nepomniachtchi and Wesley So, but both Nepo and So ended up having difficult days, while Firouzja scored 5.5 points to clinch the tournament with 2 rounds to go and a final result of 23 out of 36. Finishing in second place was Wesley So with 20 points, while third went to Hikaru Nakamura with 19.5. Checking out the day's highlights, we'll start with the game that actually clinched tournament victory for Firouzja. This was his game black against Nepomniachtchi, who was already having kind of a rough day. And in this position here, Nepo plays the move b4, which is a typical move in this kind of position. This came from an English opening, but here Firouzja pounces with the move a5. Now White had a couple ways of dealing with this one. White can go bishop to b2, bishop to d2, knight c5. These moves are all given about equal by the engine, but Nepo decides to take the pawn, which ends up being a huge tactical mistake, because now Firouzja goes f5, hitting the knight on e4. And the point is that White doesn't have knight to c5 like they would if White's pawn was still on b4. So that's why b takes a5 is a mistake, because now Black is controlling the c5 square. So White was forced to go back to knight to d2, as that's the only safe square for the knight, but now knight to c3, and this is the point. Black is hitting the queen, and the queen isn't able to defend the e-pawn along the second rank. So the knight takes e2 is going to be a huge threat here. The d3 pawn will fall quickly after that. Nepo played queen takes b7. Very, very risky, but at this point the position is already gone bad. Knight takes e2 check, king h1, and now bishop to d5, playing for discoveries against the queen. Now queen b2 I believe was the best way to limit the damage according to Compy, but instead rook e1 was played, allowing Black a number of discoveries like knight d4, knight to b4. Knight b4 was Firouzja's choice, and Nepo decides to give the queen with queen d5 and rook takes e2, but it's only 2 minor pieces. That said, White has the e5 pawn in his sights, and the bishop opens up on the diagonal, so Firouzja did have to show good technique to convert this one, but he definitely managed. Knight back to c3, trades off on e5, queen takes d3. And of course, Black's queen here is very, very powerful. White's 2 minor pieces, the 2 bishops here, don't really provide enough compensation. So Firouzja had to remain accurate here, start picking up some pawns, and eventually organize the final breakthrough, which he does here after c4, queen a3, rook to e8, looking to trade off more pieces, knight to d4, knight d6. Once again, only 2 bishops for White, so really not enough material. Black also has a passed c-pawn here, so it's just a matter of time. But of course, it is blitz, time control, 5+2, and at this point, the players are down to seconds. So of course, Nepo was going to try and defend until the very end. But now knight to e4, the knight comes in. White takes this one, knight e2, playing for a blockade, but it's really not to be. Black comes in on the light squares. Queen to c8, pushes the pawn now, and queen to c4. This is the end of the game, as White is losing material, as the queen is hitting both the rook and the knight, and there's no way to save both. So with this win and other results that played out, Firouzja was actually able to secure tournament victory with a couple rounds to go. Finishing in second place was Wesley So. Actually had kind of a difficult day. I think he ended on -1 if I counted correctly, but he had a couple of important wins, including this one against Levon Aronian, that allowed him to finish in second. So here Levon plays a very strong move, bishop to f5, offering the b7 pawn as a sacrifice in order to get the light squares with bishop to e4. Wesley takes, bishop takes b7, but now Black really needed to go rook to b8 and just challenge this bishop right away. And then from there, Black can continue with bishop to e4, trade off the bishops, and play on the light squares. But Levon decides to sacrifice the exchange here with bishop to e4, which ends up being a bit too optimistic. As Wesley grabs this one, now he pushes c4, and both sides have a very, very strong bishop on the long diagonal. With c4, he's stopping Black's queen from getting in with queen to d5. So queen to e7, but now e4, and basically Black's queen here is not able to infiltrate, and with the pawn on e4, White is able to defend the king, and basically White is an exchange up. Now the game of course was messy. F5 here the engines didn't like. They were just saying rook c1, let Black take on e4, queen to d3 or queen to b5, and yeah, White's rooks have a lot of open lines, so this should be quite good for White. But instead f5 was played, Apparently black could have taken. That looks very scary. Queen to b6 was Levon's choice, but bishop to d4. After this, white is back in control. Wesley did have to convert this endgame with the extra exchange, but he showed some very, very nice technique to do so. So I'll just show you guys how that happened. As black has one pawn for the exchange, wins the second, but now the knight is caught. Knight to b4. And bishop takes b4. The engine didn't really like this decision, suggesting rook takes a4 instead, which should be winning for white. But I think in the game, actually, Wesley ended up showing quite good technique to win this one. Maybe it was holding for black, but really didn't seem that simple. So king d7 here, king to e3. I think what the engine was saying is that black should keep the king on the king side and basically just try to defend. That's very hard to do, as white's king is going to be walking in, and it seems like eventually white should be able to break through. So Levon goes this way, but now rook to b4. King d4, and very smart play by Wesley, using the king to stop the b pawn so that the rook can now roam free and go after the h pawn. And that's why black's king was needed on the king side here to defend against this, because now king d5, rook h4, white's rook is in time to pick this one up, but the action is not over as black's king gets in here and is very, very active, and black's bishop is definitely a monster bishop defending everything, as black's king wants to pick off white's pawns and force a draw. But here Wesley finds h4, king takes g3, and now an absolutely phenomenal resource, h5, which he finds with just seconds on the clock. He was able to spot this one, because if white moves the rook away, then black is going to get enough counterplay with the f pawn and actually be able to force a draw here. So h5, f3, and it's very, very messy, but note that black's bishop is stopping the pawn, and this pawn is running. So this one is enough for black to hold the game. Instead, after h5, black's king is not in time to stop the pawn. So fantastic rook sacrifice. The pawn gets to h6, and black is not in time to stop the pawn with the bishop. So beautiful study-like motif here. King g3 is played. h7, Levon tries his last chance against white's new queen to try and defend with the two advanced pawns, but it's really not enough, and Wesley's technique here is very straightforward. King d2, king to e3, and black resigned, as next is queen to g3, queen f2, mate. So for example, f2, queen to g3, king e1, white will take, and then mate on d2. So very, very nice endgame win by Wesley. He ended up sputtering a bit at the end, but does manage, I believe with a final round draw, he was able to clinch second place in the tournament. Finally, finishing in third was Hikaru Nakamura. Definitely had an up and down event, but he managed to score a very nice win against Praggnanandhaa in the final round in order to get into clear third. And he did it with a very nice trick here in the endgame. They had been playing this endgame for some time where white is up a pawn, but black is extremely active with the knight and rook and has tons and tons of compensation. So here there's lots of ways for white to keep the game equal, but Naka takes a calculated risk with the move knight to e4, giving up the pawn on h5 with this idea in mind, rook to g3, now hitting the knight on g4 and the pawn on g7. Pragg plays rook h4, which feels like a very natural move, but he falls for the trick, f6. And now the point is this pawn cannot be taken either way. If you take with the pawn, then white has rook takes g4 with a temporary sacrifice as knight takes f6, wins back the material. And so here after gf, rook takes g4, white is just up a piece. And if knight takes f6, well then rook takes g7 check, followed by knight takes f6, and white is going to be up a piece there as well. And since black is not taking this pawn, well then the f pawn is of course very, very strong. Apparently Pragg could have played rook h1 here, followed by h5, so white has to get out of check, and then h5, and then black is actually better, but very hard to see with seconds on the clock. Rook h4, the most natural move was made, and now f6, and white is completely winning here. So g5 was the continuation, otherwise f takes g7, and white's pawn would be promoting. But now f7, king e7, and knight takes d6. Beautiful tactic. King, of course, can take the knight, but then white would be able to promote a new queen. Meanwhile, the knight is beautifully defending the pawn. So check and h5. Pragg here desperately looking for counterplay, but now rook to f3 and knight to e4, and this knight is ready to help the pawn promote. More checks, knight to e5, knight d3, king a3, rook h1, and here, believe it or not, only one winning move for white because black is turning rook a1 mate. If king a2, then black can just give a check on, I think with knight to b4, and white is forced to repeat here after king b2, rook h2. It turns out black has a perpetual check, which is very surprising because if you step up this way, then there's rook to c2, and if king to c1, then rook e2 apparently is a draw with this mechanism. Knight a2 check followed by knight to c3. So white's knight is under attack. White plays something like knight to g5 and then knight a2, knight c3, and black draws with this classic mechanism that forces the repetition. So king a2, not draw. The only winning move found by Hikaru, b4, which gives up a pawn with check, but the point is it creates an escape square for the king. Pragg takes this one, king to b3, and now white is still winning as knight takes g5, knight e6 is just such a huge threat. So rook h3, Pragg tried, but knight takes g5, and that was game over. White hits the rook, white threatens knight e6, followed by promotion, and black has a couple checks with the knight, but the rook on h3 is hanging. You can give a double check with knight to c1, but it's not really going anywhere. There's no mate for black, so white steps out of check, and once again, all the threats in the position remain. So very nice win for Hikaru as he ends up in 3rd place in the St. Louis Rapid Blitz. Well, folks, that wraps up this event. Next up will be the Sinquefield Cup, which starts Monday, August 19th. Hopefully you tune in for that one. Until next time, take care.